Next speaker is Hassan, who is a PhD candidate here at Columbia. And I just was talking to her. She writes regularly for Al Jazeera and for Electronic Intifada, that in fact she just came back from Gaza.
We have divided the talk in such way that my colleagues will introduce actually the American media, and I will look into how we as Palestinian look at this entire narrative, this international American narrative. And so when approaching this subject, I think it's imperative to look at our own local Palestinian media and how it has grown with years into facing and creating our own narrative away from the dominant international line. As an example, I'd like to use the massacre that happened on July 17, 2014 in Gaza, where four boys aged from the 9 to 11, were playing football on a beach in the Gaza Strip. Minutes before the first Israeli shell fell, foreign journalists were actually kicking a ball with them, and the foreign camera was rolling. When the first shell struck a fisherman's hut where these boys were actually playing, the camera was still rolling. As smoke rose, the first shell sent them running, seeking cover. The camera was still rolling. The second shell took their lives. Their final minutes, from the moment they were playing on the beach until the chaos of journalists rushing to them and aid workers to try to save them, all of it was on tape, recorded. The world was actually watching it live as Israel was killing these boys. And so all of it was there for you to see it. That day, the American journalist Ayman Mohyeddin of NBC tweeted, 4 Palestinian kids killed in a single Israeli airstrike. Minutes before they were killed by our hotel, I was kicking a ball with them. After this, Mohyeddin was taken off the air, which led to a major controversy online for days. The question here is, how does the coverage of a devastating war get lost in marginal issues such as the withdrawal of Ayman Mohyeddin by his employer? Whatever the reasons of NBC's decisions were to pull him, Mohyeddin was doing the kind of journalism that forced people to see Palestinians as actual human beings. But did Gazans at that time notice or even mind his arrival, his presence, and his departure? Did the discussions that take place on international media for days about U.S. bias and about U.S. fear of actually putting Israel in a bad spot or damaging Israel's telegenical image take place in Palestinians' home in the Gaza Strip? The answer is no. No Palestinian did not discuss that event. And I can tell you out of experience, whenever there is a war or an attack, we always rely on our local media, and specifically our own radio, because it is through the radio that we get to hear to which areas we have to evacuate, where to go to, which areas to leave, where to stay. So what happens in the international scene at that time is only followed by a minority of Palestinians who actually either speak English or have internet and electricity. And so that the entire debate, people are on the ground are trying to survive a war or next attack. So being there the way the international media wants to see us, and the international media was only interested in the event of the Bakr boys because foreign cameras were there, because it was broadcasted live. But all the other shellings and all the other massacres that took place just not less than 24 actually was ongoing the same evening were not captured by foreign cameras, but they were covered by local media, by local Palestinian media. And so the suspend of the Hollywood movie that was offered to the international audience was not there for that same media. And hence the murder of pictures that are captured by Palestinian journalists way less than pictures that are, or stills that are captured by foreign cameras. And additionally, and I think that's very important, is that the massacres of the Bakr boys happened right in front of the hotel of where the journalists were residing. And so the staff were residing in the hotel exactly at that beach where they were relaxing after a long, long day of covering the events, but hardly any foreign journalist would jeopardize his safety or security to reach neighborhoods that were leveled to the ground by Israel and where more than 100 people a day, including children, were slaughtered. This time, all of this was covered by local media. They captured the scenes. And for Palestinians, these journalists are heroes. And so during the last slaughter in the Gaza Strip, 11 brave Palestinian journalists lost their lives. And two of these journalists actually filmed their own death as Israel was striking the area that they want to cover for the world to see. And so the Israeli army does not target, they don't make a difference between a journalist or not. And international law regarding the attack of journalists is crystal clear. It's a war crime. And what's additionally important here is to see that Israel has two narratives to tell. The first one is a narrative of the same exact event that has to be told to the Israeli audience. And the second narrative of the same event has to be told to an international audience, specifically the Western one. And the demands of these two audiences are contradictory, in the sense that, to the Israeli audience, Israel has to show the scale of the punishment that it inflicts upon Palestinians by telling Israelis, don't worry, we are teaching the Palestinians a lesson. We are actually taking revenge on a scale which is much larger than the scale on which Palestinians can harm us.
1 minute.
And so the other story that they have to tell is of the same event, but then to an international audience saying, well, we could have used much, much more violence, but we have restricted ourselves because we are measured and civilized just like you. But the event is the same. And so this different narrative of the same and exact event, it happens in collaboration with Western outlets. And it's the same story of an ethnically cleansed, Jewish-only towns that are happening under a system of apartheid, but still Israel can sell it as security because it has two narratives. This scenario, in my opinion, is failing in the past years because of two reasons. The first one is that the brutality and savagery of Israel is becoming has unprecedented extent that is beyond, you cannot cover it anymore. And so the effects also, the prolongity of the conflict, 51 days of attacks in the Gaza Strip is not the same as 8 days. And at some point, you cannot just cover the language of violence that Israel is using, even after the departure of foreign journalists. The second reason is because in the past 15 years, there's a young generation of Palestinians that understand how Western media functions in general. And so this generation of Palestinians is able to write their own narrative, and they're able to send it out to a consistency and a multiplicity of other forms of media. I'm just giving quickly an example of these alternatives, in which what also happens is that now there's a collaboration with the Palestinian diaspora outside. Millions of Palestinians through the internet are in contact with Palestinians inside. And so everything that happens in Arabic is now being translated by Palestinian into hundreds of languages, in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, and name it. And so example of these narratives, there's a Facebook page, it's called Shihab News, and it's a Palestinian initiative. It has 3 million followers on Facebook. Every single day it posts a narrative of the Palestinian, the side, everything that the New York Times will not put online, they will put it. It is so influential that Facebook shut it down for almost a week, and then people started protesting because it had to come back. And so Shihab News has shown that there is another way. Something else that happened recently is a hashtag called Ask Hamas. It was successful in reaching a Western audience and sending a message from Hamas, the Palestinian resistance movement, that is being censored by mainstream media for being so-called terrorist organization. And so at the end of the day, these are only examples of what Palestinian narratives are and how they've been able to break the silence. And so whether the New York Times or Tel Aviv or Washington are changing their opinion, something is shaking. And it's the presence of students still in campuses, whether here in Colombia or all over the globe during Apartheid Week. This what happened in South Africa before the media knew. They were only telling loser story and they had to shift. And so that is the narrative that is coming to us. I think I was screaming.
Thank you. Finally, Joe Catron, who also writes regularly for Electronic Intifada, 7 minutes.
Thank you, and I'm very glad that you mentioned Palestinian journalists. The number I've seen most often for the number killed during the 2014 offensive from the International Federation of Journalists and others was 17, I think. We can figure that out later. Also, 35 were seriously injured, making Israel the world's second most dangerous country for journalists, second only to Syria last year. And many of these deaths were clearly intentional. Hamed Shahab, the first journalist to die in the offensive, was targeted in an airstrike on his marked media vehicle. It's also worth remembering that Palestinian journalists are frequently attacked by Israeli forces in the West Bank. At the moment, or at least last month, when I found the most recent number, 15 of them were imprisoned for charges such as working for provocative media outlets. And I think this is a better testimony to the value of their work than anything I could say here. There are a few things I'd like to say specifically about my own experiences as a source, observer, and also consumer of international media in Gaza before, during, and in between the last two offensives in 2012 and 2014. The first is about the crisis-oriented model which international media now use. When there's escalation in a place like Gaza, international media will rapidly deploy hundreds of new journalists there overnight. And these people are not any sort of specialists. They may have been anywhere from Ukraine to Venezuela only a few days earlier. And it can be a little shocking how little some of them may know about what's going on. The reports they generate are not always the best informed, and in particular they can be mentioning a great deal of context that would be necessary for fully understanding the situation, both what happens in between these escalations, the day-to-day Israeli aggressions of the siege, for example, and historical information such as the Nakba, Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948, which underlies the whole conflict. The second is how a lot of international coverage, nearly all of it, is shaped by overseas editors. And we've heard a little bit about this in the case of Ayman Mohiuddin, who was temporarily withdrawn before a great deal of pressure, both from the public and other journalists, forced his return. Another example is Diana Magni, who the day after Ayman was withdrawn was also reassigned from covering the conflict in 2014 because she tweeted a little too frankly, rather understandably I thought, about Israeli settlers who were sitting on a hill in Sderot overlooking the Gaza Strip, cheering on the bombing and threatening international media crews on the scene, such as hers. But these are only the examples of the inevitable conflict between journalists on the ground and editors in faraway Western capitals that have become public. It's a constant tension which you rapidly become aware of if you're in Gaza dealing with media in one of these situations. Finally, I'd like to say a little bit about what Gara Marous called the compelling story of the white Western activist in the war zone. This is the way in which media gravitates towards the experiences or impressions, presences of Westerners, non-Palestinians, in this particular circumstance, which applies as well to other kinds of foreign presences. It could be white Western institutions, such as UNRWA, whose facilities were much more covered than others, which were similarly destroyed by Israel, or, for that matter, white Western journalists of the international corporate sort, all of whom receive increased coverage and perhaps an exaggerated voice compared to their or our actual role in things. One journalist who's spoken about this and attempted in his own way to justify it is Nicholas Kristof, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In a 2010 interview with Sheila Coronel, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her name, I understand she's a professor of journalism here, he said, "It's an awful lot easier to get readers to read about some New Yorker who's off in Haiti than to get them to read about a Haitian who's doing good work in Haiti. And it's already so hard to get readers to care about Congo or Darfur or whatever, that to miss the chance to create this kind of protagonist, this kind of vehicle that can help tug people in, strikes me as a missed opportunity. But I'm very sensitive to the notion that, sort of highlighting the wrong kind of hero sometimes." Now, Kristof here is easy to bash. But honestly, I can't deny that he's on to something. This has been my experience not only with international media, but also, it must be said, many international activists who are much quicker to react, for example, when there are a few of their fellow international activists sitting in a hospital by the Gaza Strip barrier, as opposed to dozens of Palestinian patients and staff sitting in the same hospital. Or when foreigners go to sea in a fishing boat and get machine gunned by the Israeli Navy in a strange sort of political theater. This is something which will get a lot more attention of all sorts, not only from the media, than the Palestinian fishermen who routinely go out and are actually shot at with real guns. So it's a kind of racial and colonial privilege which is prevalent that has a lot to do with drawing attention to certain situations. The killing of the Bakr boys on the beach, for which Ayman Mohyeldin was present, or the shelling and ultimate destruction of El Wafa Hospital, or the shooting death of Salam Shamali in Shijaya. These were not particularly rare instances, as you said. Even the documentation of them wasn't particularly unusual. The only unique factor is that there was some kind of international element which brought them more attention than they might have otherwise received. Now, in the medium term, I think, of course, the task is to shift these racist, colonialist dynamics so that that's not the case, so that actual Palestinian experiences get the same kind of attention. In the short term, I don't know that any of us have actually figured out how to deal with it responsibly. What we should do when our presence in these kinds of political theater might draw attention to a situation using dynamics that, of course, we all hate. It's something to consider, and maybe we'll find the answer here tonight. Okay, that's all from me for now.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.